Professor Pandey, we have the Vice Chancellor. This will be the Vice Chancellor's first extramural lecture in this department. I mean, in this university. She joined only recently.
Yes,
Our students are very interested in this area.
okay.
Some of them are working on the dissertation in this area as well.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And some of them are working on trauma in refugee narratives and trauma in other narratives as well.
Okay. So it will be useful for them. Yeah.
Very, very useful. And the MA students are working on partition literature.
Too.
So they have taken, and it's there also in the BA course
Yeah, yeah.
of Odisha. So it's a very, very relevant topic that you've chosen to speak on today.
Yeah. Yeah, I look forward to.
We all look forward to it. Our Vice Chancellor, Professor Gitanjali Das, has joined us. And thank you for joining us, madam. The department alumnus and associate editor of our journal Literary Oracle, Dr. Deepshika Rautrai, will moderate the event. Over to you, Deepshika.
A very good evening to all. I am Deepshika Rautrai, and it is indeed a pleasure for me to welcome everyone present in this meet to the 11th Distinguished Lecture Series hosted by Postgraduate Department of English of Berhampur University. Today we have an eminent speaker, Dr. Beerendra Pandey, Professor and Dean, KIIT School of Language as our speaker. We have our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Gitanjali Das, who will inaugurate today's lecture series. I request Dr. Shruti Das, Head PG Department of English, to introduce her.
Thank you very much, Deepshika. I take the privilege and the pride of introducing our Vice Chancellor, the first ever woman Vice Chancellor of Berhampur University, to introduce her and invite her to inaugurate this August lecture. Professor Gitanjali Das is the first woman Vice Chancellor of Berhampur University, the premier university of South Odisha. She is the Vice President of All India Political Science Association. She has the distinction of being the master trainer in the UGC-sponsored SAM program for women administrators. Before joining Berhampur University in 2022 as Vice Chancellor, she has adorned various positions of administrative importance in other institutions. She was the chairperson PG Council, FM University from 2013 to 2015, member syndicate from 2013 to 2017, warden PG hostels, chairperson anti-sexual harassment committee from 2014 to 2021, and dean School of Sciences and Humanities at Fakir Mohun University, Balasore, to name a few. A political scientist and teacher par excellence, Professor Das' teaching career, like her academic career, have had their roots in institutions of rural Odisha like Ganjam and Nayagar, and have extended to elite institutions in Delhi and Odisha, and also to Brisbane and Australia. As a student, she has been the recipient of junior and senior research fellowships and a teacher fellowship in Indian polity and economy. After getting her MPhil degree from Delhi University, she pursued her doctoral studies in Berhampur University and was awarded PhD in 1998. A researcher at heart, at the moment, she is working on a major research project funded by ICSSR New Delhi under the aegis of IMPRESS scheme. And the project is on tribal women, climate change, and social equity in selective districts in Odisha. 35 MPhils and 5 PhDs have been awarded under her supervision, and 6 PhD works are in progress. She has authored 5 books and published over 35 research papers in journals of national and international repute, and edited the prestigious journal Anvesa, which is the Journal of the Social Sciences, Fakir Mohun University, Odisha. Major part of her research focuses on women's rights and empowerment, politics and human rights, climate change, migrant and tribal studies, and she has been invited to speak on aspects of these seminal issues in more than 70 occasions in various institutions in India and abroad. A strong exponent of political and social equity and women issues, she has received training by the UNHRC and ICRC on international humanitarian law and refugee law in 2003. Her leadership was appreciated and she was shortlisted by MHRD for training under the LEAD program. While her special interests lie in the fields of political and social equity, climate change, women, migrant, and tribal studies, her interests are varied and multidisciplinary. We welcome you, madam, to this August evening. Thank you for giving your time. I know how busy you are. Now we request you to inaugurate this lecture and say a few words in context. Thank you, madam. Over to you.
Thank you. I welcome all the participants, and especially Beerendra Pandey. I was going through his works. It is very interesting because he has also worked on the postmodernism, which is also an area of my interest, because we always dismiss the meta. We just want to say, I just want to say that we should revisit the local narratives and deconstruct the meta narratives. So it will be my pleasure to introduce him and to welcome him. And this is an opportunity which COVID has given us, because there is a blended mode teaching and learning process, and we can have n number of webinars where physically, if you are not able to invite people, at least we can connect with them through through different forums. So I really feel happy to be with all of you, and I warmly welcome today's speaker, Professor Beerendra Pandey, and also the other delegates and participants from various parts of Odisha and maybe throughout the country. And my dear students are also there. And I'm very happy and glad that to see the Shruti organizing all these lecture series. This is a very fruitful event, and this adds to the academic endeavor of all our students. So I can request our resource persons to start with his deliberation.
Thank you very much, madam. Thank you for those kind words of yours. Over to Deepshika to introduce Professor Pandey and to continue to moderate the session. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for this lecture series. Dr. Beerendra Pandey works as a professor and dean in the School of Languages, KIIT deemed to be university in Bhubaneswar, India. He is a Fulbright scholar from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, from where he received MA and PhD in English literature. Dr. Pandey has over 34 years of teaching experience from the undergraduate to the PhD levels at Tribhuvan University, Kathmandu, Nepal. He is a well-known writer in the area of literary and cultural studies. He has about half a dozen of books to his credit. He has authored 11 book chapters, and the most frequently cited of these is Pedagogy of Partition Literature in the Light of Trauma Theory in Southern Post-Colonialisms, which was published by Routledge in 2008. His forthcoming article is The Barking Dog and the Crying Bird in Partition Stories, Beastly Modernisms and Subaltern Animism of Manto, Rakesh and Anand, to be published by Edinburgh University this year. In recent years, Dr. Pandey has devoted his critical attention to the development of his own Maithili literature and culture. He has contributed enormously with his critical writings on Nepali Maithili literature and Mithila painting, for which the President of Nepal conferred on him the prestigious Vidyapati Purashkar in 2017. Sir, it's indeed an honor for us to have you as our speaker for our 11th Distinguished Lecture Series. I welcome you again on behalf of Berhampur University to speak on partition violence as cultural trauma, politics of the canonization of Indian English partition literature. Thank you very much. We can start our lecture series. You're welcome, sir.
Uh, Honorable Madam Vice Chancellor of Berhampur University, Dr. Stuti Das, and the delegates. Thank you all for inviting me for this lecture series. Uh, the title of my presentation is Partition Violence as Cultural Trauma, Politics of the Canonization of Indian uh, English Partition Fiction. Basically, what I am trying to do is to explore the language of trauma in Indian partition fiction, Indian English partition fiction. This exploration shows that there is the presence of ethically mediated cultural trauma in fictional representation. It is a presence which functions as a memory to settle old discourse rather than a way to escape from the cycle of communal violence. So this presentation, which turns to the concepts of trauma as tools of literary and cultural analysis, complicates the canonization of Indian English partition novels from Kushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, written in 1956, down to Chaman Nahal's Azadi 1975. I do not intend to engage with novels written thereafter, because novels written thereafter, particularly after the Delhi riots against the Sikhs, uh, uh, representation-wise, they are better in quality than these so-called canonical novels written before the Delhi riots. And I also don't intend to engage more with women writers. I am just taking up one women author, which is a very celebrated women author from Pakistan, Partition. In comparison to her, I find the Indian English novels by Indian writers, uh, one purely Indian, one Canadian Sikh, much better in quality than the Cracking India, uh, which is described in women's studies department in most of the American universities. I think in academia it is much more popular than the other two novels by women. My focus is mostly on writings by male writers, particularly Kushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, Nahal's Azadi, and Bapsi Sidhwa's Ice Candy Man or Tracking India as it was published in the United States. So let me, after having laid down the thesis of my presentation, let me come to the concept of trauma. Trauma is basically a medical condition called PTSD, which means post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a kind of emotional or psychological blow landed on the victim by an injurious or a life-threatening event. The blow generates such a magnitude of shock which breaks through the protective shield of the mind to keep intruding into the consciousness even much after the occurrence of the event. Psychologists attribute the outbreak to such risk factors as assault, domestic abuse, prison stay, rape, riot, terrorism, and war. Trauma theory converges with fields such as psychology, sociology, history, ethics, literature, and aesthetics. In the current era of cultural criticism, it is a much valorized literary theory. This is because of a Marxist inspired focus on class and the recovery of the subaltern or dissident perspectives. The cultural significance stems from the psychological conceptualization of the traumatic memory, which returns along with the shock of originary suffering. What is at the center of the manifestation of the trauma is latency or the temporary delay, which, however, should not be misconstrued as repression, because the trauma shows up with a vengeance over a period of time, especially when triggered by a similar event. It is a misconception that trauma can be repressed. Trauma can never be repressed. At some point or the other, it does manifest itself, and when it manifests, it comes up with a vengeance. Now I turn to cultural trauma. Uh, Traumatic temporality, that is this temporary delay, means that ethical authenticity, which is the attempt to manipulate the ways in which, for example, the Indian nationalistic historiography produces the narrative on partition, must always be contaminated by inauthenticity. It is in this very manipulation where cultural trauma is seen. Cultural trauma interprets an individual's or a people's trauma in a specific cultural context as a gaping hole in the cultural fabric which must be patched up. This patch up work is actually a mediation which conjoins collective memory and national identity through cultural and nationalistic templates. In the case of the trauma of 1947, cultural trauma is produced through mutually exclusive claims of the Indian and Pakistani survivors that create their own master narratives in support of the claims made. What the theory of cultural trauma underscores vis-a-vis the partition violence of 1947 is that the seminal event is not as much naturally traumatic, as much it becomes traumatic because of the cultural templates through which it is experienced. So let us have a look at the high politics historiography of partition of India. Because it is in the high politics historiography that we find cultural trauma. That cultural trauma is locatable. A privileging of the gloss of nationality over objectivity characterizes the treatment of the high politics of 1947 in the histories of India and Pakistan. Depending whether the historian is an Indian or a Pakistani, the hero in one version is portrayed as the villain in the other. In the hero-villain swap game, the real subject matter of partition, that is the violence that constituted it, gets elided. The elision of violence that the victims and the survivors suffered is deservedly criticized as elitist and modernizing in the recent subaltern interventions by historian Gyanendra Pandey, Ritu Menon, Urvashi Butalia, and others. The high politics historiography, however, throws a flood of light on the use of the prose of otherness, which also filters into canonical literature on partition and which helps forge the sense of community or nationhood through a discourse of violence attributed to the other. This patch up is of a kind which subalternist historian Gyanendra Pandey, this patch up through the prose of otherness, is of a kind which subalternist historian Gyanendra Pandey seeks to undo through a foregrounding of Saadat Hasan Manto's capturing of the specificity of the partition violence. Through the essay which he wrote in 1994, The Prose of Otherness, Gyanendra Pandey tries to write the violence back into the history of 1947. The essay, that is Gyanendra Pandey's essay, The Prose of Otherness, is starting with an epigraph from Toba Tek Singh and ending with the praise of Manto's language of violence in the story, emphasizes the story writer's subaltern humanism which according to him, that is Gyanendra Pandey, helps him avoid being blinded by the contending nationalisms of India and Pakistan. Manto's awareness that nationhood or community may be forced through the attribution of violence to the forces outside the immediate boundaries of the nation or the community helps the Urdu story writer delineate the partition violence in a story such as Khol Do, in English we can call it Open It, Thanda Ghost, in English we call it Cold Mate, and Tova Tek Singh, and the collection of Bhaisnets called Shihai Hashiye, which in English we call Black Margins, with such remarkable intensity, depth, and objectivity that disrupts the official narratives, which basically elide the violence through the use of the prose of others. The official narratives actually, elide the violence through the use of the prose of otherness, but Manto, by doing away with this language of the prose of otherness, he writes the violence back into the partition text. Manto's partition prose captures the proto-language of violence through a language verging on a meta-ironic transmission of trauma. Meta-irony is my formulation. Let me explain it before I proceed further. This meta-irony, when irony is very sharp, it has intensity. So when the intensity of irony combines with the shock of trauma, then both the shock, the intensity of the shock and the intensity of the irony is magnified. And it is this magnification, this heightening of the shock effect of both trauma and irony is what I call, meta-irony. Actually, I got the idea of this meta-irony while watching a 10-hour long film, French film, subtitled in English. It's Claude Lanzmann's Shoah on the Holocaust. The film director actually very meta-ironically transmits the trauma onto the the people witnessing the audience, witnessing the film. Manto does the same kind of thing. Manto's partition prose has the same kind of effect on his readers. When you read Manto's Shihai Hashiye, the black margins, the Bhaisnets in Shihai Hashiye, what you find there is that Manto causes a vicarious re-experiencing of the shock of the partition trauma in an attempt to act out for a moral recognition of the traumatic shock rather than the ethical working through, as it happens in much of Indian English partition fiction. Let me explain this concept a little bit more. This terminology, two terminologies, four terminologies here. One is morality versus ethics, and another is acting out versus working. I derived this concept of morality versus ethics from 2002 book by a Jewish philosopher. His name is Avishai Marglit. The name of that book is The Ethics of Memory, wherein he says that morality and ethics are not the same. He says that morality is universal and it is a thin relationship, whereas ethics is a thick relationship, and it has affinity with a particular community or a particular nation. So morality becomes a very, very positive word, and ethics becomes a rather a negative word in Avishai Margalit's explanation of these two terminologies in that book. The point I am trying to make here is that that ethical thickness is minimized, is almost not there in Manto. Rather than that, there is moral recognition of the traumatic shock, not an ethical rendition of the traumatic shock, rather than just the opposite, a moral recognition of the traumatic shock. This is what makes his work, so powerful and so objective and so overwhelmingly shocking to the audience. Now, this shocking, the way Manto shocks his audience into trauma. Every time you read him, you are shocked. So this frequent shocking is what I call acting out. Acting out is a psychological notion. You just act out the trauma as it happened, versus trying to ethically work through the trauma or culturally, politically work through the trauma. That political, cultural working through is not there in Manto. In sharp contrast to him, we find this cultural, political working through in Kushwant Singh or Balachandra Rajan or Chaman Nahar. These writers, they are ethically trying to work through the trauma, rather than just you know redeem the traumatic pressure or lessen the traumatic pressure through constant shocking the audience into trauma. Okay. So a predominantly meta-ironic mode which Manto has is clairvoyance itself. It's a very pure mode of looking, which is the only way not to turn away from a reality that is literally blind. This mode of looking is nothing but the actual acting out of the partition trauma. Whether in the case of Shakina in Cold Meat or Tovatek Singh, which creates an overwhelming shock effect on the witness, for example, the doctor in Koldo, and the readers in general. Now I turn to Indian English partition fiction, particularly Train to Pakistan and Azadi and Crack. An exploration of the language of trauma in Indian English partition fiction shows that it fails to maintain the high standards set by Manto, and instead it reveals the presence of ethically mediated cultural trauma. In contrast to Manto's partition prose, Indian English partition novels, mostly by male writers, and that up to 1975, revealed two symptomatic possibilities of the return of the historical trauma as discourse. One is the language of martyrdom, and the other is the use of the prose of otherness. The language of martyrdom and the use of the prose of otherness. When the language of sacrifice is deployed, the literature of trauma turns into a redemptive, fetishistic narrative that excludes or marginalizes trauma through a teleological story that protectively presents values and wishes as viably realized. The fetishistic narrative denies the trauma as reality. That is, the trauma happened, but it had no lasting effect. This is the kind of the impression that is communicated to the reader through the language of martyrdom. Example of this mode are Kushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, Balachandra Rajan's The Dark Dancer, and Chaman Nahal's Azadi. As the drama of the sacrifice of Gandhi is played out in these novels, the values that the discourse of martyrdom creates seek to give ethical comfort to the Indians on the one hand, and on the other to bring about a moral denunciation of Pakistani Muslims. In ethical representation of trauma, as in these partition novels, a very thin universalism overlays a very thick particularism. One way of morally denouncing the enemy other is to make use of what is known in trauma theory as a structural trauma. This kind of trauma brings the entire order of language to the precipice of its basis in trauma, thereby producing only equivocal truths. The structural trauma is represented in the biblical tradition of the fall. One then seeks to expel or destroy individuals or groups alleged to be the radically other. As you see in the biblical, representation of the fall, the way Eve is othered, the same kind of othering is what I am, that for that othering I am using words like verbs like expelling or destroying individual or groups, alleged to be the radically other, as such, and the cause of the lost harmony. Dushman Singh Train to Pakistan turns out to be a perfect example of a novel that uses a structural trauma, particularly the way Singh presents Manu Majra as an allegory of India of religious tolerance and communal harmony. As the outbreak of the partition riots poisons the Indianic ambience, Singh reverts to the 6 age-old language of discord against the Muslims by stereotyping them as ruthless, them means Muslims as ruthless, and prurient savages. And if I am allowed to share a file, I will take you to the text. So please allow me to share. Okay, this is the example I have from Dushman Singh's Train to Pakistan. Jagga tells his co-prisoner Iqbal about the brutality of the evacuating soldiers, and look at the language used. This a truck full of Baluch soldiers were going from Amritsar to Lahore. When they were getting near the Pakistani border, the soldiers began to stick bayonets in 6 going along the road. The driver would slow down near a cyclist or a pedestrian. The soldiers on the footboard would stab him in the back, and then the driver would accelerate away fast. They killed many people like this and were feeling happier and happier as they got nearer Pakistan. And then again, you look how the Muslims are being othered here, again in the same novel. The Sikhs were sullen and angry. Never trust a Musliman, they said. The last Guru had warned them that Muslims had no loyalty. He was right. All through the Muslim period of Indian history, sons had imprisoned or killed their own fathers, and brothers had blinded brothers to get the throne. And Muslims were never once to respect women. Sikh refugees had told women jumping into wells and burning themselves rather than fall into the hands of Muslims. Those who did not commit suicide were paraded naked in the streets, raped in public, and then murdered. These were reasons enough to be angry with someone. Okay, so they decided to be angry with the Muslims. Sikhs decided to be angry with the Muslims. Muslims were basically ungrateful. Logic was never a strong point with Sikhs. When they were roused, logic did not matter at all. Okay, stop presenting. So these 2 examples that I have from this Dushman Singh's Train to Pakistan. The first one, the Baluch soldiers come out as totally evil and completely irrational violence mongers, indulging in such cruelties of which even the much maligned monsters in Hindu mythology would be ashamed. Singh continues in his Muslim bashing in the second quote, which I had shown you. In the second quote, what he does in the second quote, there is a totally negative portrayal of the Muslim. In the passage which I showed you, Kushwan Singh harps on the negativity to justify the six counter violence, euphemistically presented in that passage as anger, look monstrous in the face of his gentle criticism of the six as rash when roused to anger, tagged at the tail of that long passage. So the passage as a whole shows that Singh shifts almost the entire blame onto the Muslims for the massive violence that occurred during the partition of India. It is the use of the prose of otherness as above, which turns out to be the second symptomatic possibility of the discourse of trauma. Yes, the second possibility, symptomatic possibility is exactly this prose of otherness. The second symptom features quite prominently in Chamal Nahal's Azadi in the form of a stereotypical representation of the Muslims uh, there uh, in Chamal Nahal's Azadi. He particularly describes a parading of women in Narowal, a town in what is what was then West Punjab, what is now Pakistan. I take you to the passage again there. Look at that passage. Actually, I'll tell you when I read this passage the first time. First of all, I take you to the passage and then I'll tell you what I felt when I read this novel the first time, particularly this passage. Sorry. Let it. What happened? Why it is? Hold on. Let me try again. Why it comes as blood? Oh, it comes as blood. I don't know why. This is the problem with technology. Okay, now visible. Okay, let me just read out to you the passage.
It was visible.
What it was visible? Okay, hold on.
Yes, sir.
Oh, I read out uh, from the paper. I just read this out. So here is the description. The procession arrived. Arun counted them. There were 40 women marching two abreast. Their ages varied from 16 to 30. Although to add to the grotesqueness of the display, there were two women marching right at the end of the column who must have been over 60. They were all stark naked. Their heads were completely shaven. So were their armpits. So were their pubic regions. The bruises on their bodies showed they had been beaten and manhandled. Their masters walked beside them, and if any of the women sagged or hung behind, they prodded her along with the whips they carried. At the end of the session marched a single drummer with a flat drum, thumping heavily on it and announcing their arrival. The procession moved through the bazaar, and along with the procession moved a rover of obscenities, foul abuses, crude personal gestures, spurts of a sputum, odd articles like small coins, faded flowers, cigarette butts, and biddies that were thrown at the women As soon as the women came near, the section of the crowd became hysterical, raped them, put it inside of them, the filthy Hindu beaches, the kafir women. Some said worse things. Then came the shower of a spittle. Almost everyone spat, and hundreds of tongues were pushed forward inside their teeth, and hundreds of uplifted faces, cannon like, fired the saliva. Bits of the saliva fell on the crowd ahead, but no one minded as long as the main salvo hit the women. Many men in the front rows crowds lifted their lungis to display their genitals to them. And almost to the last man, whether they spat or shouted or through thing means through the penis, or just stood their mouths open, they started at the pubic regions of the women through indelicate exposure. Those areas had lost their glory, lost all magic, and there was only a small slippery aperture you saw there. But men's eyes were settled on these apertures. And the moment women passed ahead, the eyes were settled on the bruised, buttocks. Uh, I tell you my own experience. When I read this passage, this novel the first time, and I was particularly, finished reading this passage. I was living then in the, Stony Brook University apartment. I was on the first floor. There was a Pakistani family on the ground floor, and Pakistanis, they speak Urdu. So Urdu is very much like Hindi. So there was a very close relationship between my family and the family of that Pakistani family. Particularly, my wife and his wife, they would be talking a lot and also exchanging foods and things like that. And remember, I come from Bihar. Nepal, Bihar border. Part of my identity is Bihari, part of my identity is also Nepali. Some of my land falls in Bihar, some of my land also falls in Nepal. And Bihar was not as much involved into partition violence as Bengal was and as Punjab was. So my location is what I'm trying to tell you is that my location, there is a bit of a distancing if you look at my location. But despite this distancing, when I read this passage, actually, I felt like if I had a pistol, then I would have gone down, and with the pistol I would have shot all every member of that Pakistani family. I felt so inflamed while reading this passage. I felt so inflamed. I immediately wanted to take it. I remember, I am not a Punjabi, I am not a Bengali, whose family had directly suffered in this partition. As I told you, I am my identity is partly Bihari, partly also Nepali. So, despite this distancing, I felt like that. I thought there must be something wrong with this novel. And at that time, I was doing a coursework on post-colonial literature, and Bapsi Sidhwa's Cracking India had been prescribed in that course. And when the teaching in the class had been done, everybody was praising the book as if, look how, feminist she is, her focus, her representation of the violence from the woman's perspective and things like that. I mean, those things are there. Even Azadi is a great novel. If you look at it from the perspective of refugee literature, it is a great refugee literature. But then I also reread Cracking India. And when I reread Cracking India, I found Bapsi Sidhwa being even more mischievous in the use of the prose of otherness than Nahal. So I also take you to what Bapsi Sidhwa writes, and then I'll comment on the two passages. Uh, Bapsi Sidhwa writes, this is from Cracking India. Suddenly, a posse of sweating English Tommies wearing only khaki shorts, socks, and boots runs up in the lane directly below us, and on their heels a mob of six. Their long hair and beards rampant, long fevered eyes are glowing in fanatic faces, pours into the narrow lane roaring slogans, holding curved swords, showing up a maniac wave of violence that sets Aya to trembling as she holds me tight. A naked child twitching on a spear stuck between her shoulders is waved like a flag. Her screamless mouth agape, she is staring straight up at me. A crimson fury blinds me. I want to dive into the bestial creature clawing in trails, plucking eyes, tearing limbs, gouging hearts, smashing brains. But the creature has too many stony hearts, too many shortless eyes, deaf ears, mindless brains, and tons of entwined interests. And then a slowly advancing mob of Muslim gundas. Look at the language now. When she is describing the Sikhs, when it comes to Muslims, uh, then she says, then a slowly advancing mob of Muslim gundas packed so tight that we can see only the tops of their heads, roaring Allahu Akbar, Ya Ali, and Pakistan Zindabad. The terror the mob generates is palpable, like an evil paralyzing spell. The terrible procession, like a sluggish river, flows beneath us. Every short while, a group of men, like a whirling eddy, stalls, and like the widening circles of a treacherous eddy dissolving in the mainstream, leaves its center the pulpy flotsam of a mangled body. So, what is Nahal? What is Nahal doing, and what is Shudwa doing in these two passages? Nahal is making a total othering. Nahal is making a total othering of the Muslims. He is a stereotypical representations of the Muslim who has the potentiality to stoke the fires of dormant hatreds in many of Nahal's readers. And this his stereotyping, in this stereotyping, the Muslim otherness is so extravagantly blown up, uh, and that the reader becomes inflamed, and you know, uh, if you are a Hindu or a Sikh reader, uh, you feel so you feel to retaliate. You know that retaliatory uh, violence, that feeling of retaliatory violence is generated in the reader. So this is a way of legitimatizing a retaliatory violence, which actually happened in India. The Sikhs and the Hindus basically retaliated against the violence that the Muslims in Pakistan had perpetrated on the Hindus and the Sikhs. And what Sidhwa is doing? Sidhwa even outdoes Nahal in the use of the prose of otherness. Her politics of memory in her ethical, her politics of memory in her ethical, not moral attempt to create a Pakistani identity through the prose of otherness. In order to refurbish the tarnished image of the Pakistani Muslims, she naturalizes, justifies, and even elides the partition violence in West Punjab. That the riot took place in Lahore cannot be left unmentioned, but it can be pointed out that Muslims react to Sikh provocations and attacks. Her politics, you look at her politics. Sidhwa's politics is the violence that she's describing is in Lahore, right? And Muslims are the majority in Lahore. So the Hindus and the Sikhs would be at the receiving end. But the way she represents that in that passage, it seems as if the provocateurs were the Hindus and the Sikhs, particularly the Sikhs, and Muslims are merely reacting. So in Shidva's portrayal, the Sikhs emerge as the most virulent kind of a beast. Muslims who react not as an organized army but as gundas. That the Muslim mob consists of underground elements that can be found in any civilized city is Shidva's ploy to elide violence, uh, or consign the violence the to boundary outside the community, outside the Muslim community, or outside the Lahori Muslim community. Shidva keeps herself on the same othering spree even while talking about the violence in East Punjab, especially while relating Ranna's story. So when she is talking about what happened to Ranna in East Punjab, which is Indian part of Punjab, obviously Sikhs are the ones who are the perpetrators. So she is very hard in her description there. But when it comes to in her description about the Muslims in Lahore, she is so soft on them, but very hard on the Sikhs there. This is the politics. So these kind of the language of the prose of otherness is actually the second symptomatic symptom or flaw through which writers are trying to patch up this hole that the cultural trauma of partition has created. Okay, so what we learn from these examples? What we learn from these examples is that a constitution of the community through a discourse of eliding and naturalizing the violence and ascribing it to the other, as found overtly in Shidva but available implicitly in Nahal, has led to the alignment of community and perpetual hostility in South Asia. In Urvashi Butalia's discussion with Bapsi Shidva and in a subtle reference to cracking India itself, it is this kind of the shockingly biased representation which, as Urvashi Butalia insinuates there, assigns chauvinist history masquerading as nationalism, or rather chauvinism masquerading as nationalism. This is a quote from that interview. The politics of the language of violence in such celebrated classics as Azadi or Cracking India, or for that matter, Train to Pakistan, raises the question: what kind of language writers of partition and communal violence should employ that neither reduces the specificity of the experience nor nullifies the possibility of coexistence? The answer lies in developing a humanistic critical consciousness. And I quote from Edward Said, who says, instead of saying, these are two warring ethnic identities, simple opposition, immemorial feuds, hatreds, we rather say, these are two communities of suffering. This should have been the line of these writers. Then one can resolve in some way the problem by looking at the possibilities of coexistence, not the notion of separation and partition. So now I come to the concluding part of my lecture, and here is my conclusion. Indian partition's framing of 1947 in terms of its traumatic encounter with the cataclysmic violence of the watershed year turns out to be a mediated and hence inauthentic deployment of trauma to political ends. Such an unraveling of the discourse of trauma in Indian English partition fiction shows a shared interest in the relationship between trauma and the politics of historiographical representation. And this unraveling actually deserves our critical attention. Because this unraveling brings an awareness that necessitates a rethinking of the canon of Indian English partition literature. Finally, the criticism of Indian English partition literature must concentrate on exploring the relationship between the already traumatized subject and the state. It is an exploration which reveals the framing of the partition of 1947 is not so much due to the interest in the ontology of the human dimension, as much it is because of the epistemology of the literary writers' collective representations that draw on an existing concept of community or nation. Good. Oh, this is why, Amrita Pritam's Pinjar, Mohan Rakesh's The Owner of the Rubble, and of course, Manku's story, you will find great partition literature, real partition literature in vernacular writings rather than in Indian English literature, which has a kind of an elitist and nationalist, uh, you know, uh, bias. So this is what is my conclusion. So,
Yes, now I request Dr. T. Ishwar Rao from the PG Department of English, Berhampur University, to offer the vote of thanks.
Okay, thank you, Deepshikha. Good evening, everyone, to the one and all present here. Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Geetanjali Das, respected Speaker Beerendra Pandey, esteemed Head of the Department Dr. Suthi Das, respected Balwada Tripathi sir, and Anil Kumar Kriya, and my dear students, scholars, and participants. It is my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of the PG Department of English, Berhampur University, Banjavihar, on the occasion of 11th lecture in the distinguished lecture series by Dr. Beerendra Pandey, Dean and Professor KIIT School of Language, KIIT deemed to be University, Bhubaneswar. Today, Professor Beerendra Pandey explained partition violence as a cultural trauma, politics of the canonization of Indian English partition literature. It was really informative and insightful because the session threw light on many scholarly dimensions regarding the subject matter. The question answer session following the presentation was very interesting and rewarding, particularly from the point of view of the students, scholars. I extend my gratitude to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Geetanjali Das, for taking her time out of her busy schedule to grade the occasion. On behalf of the department, I thank Professor Beerendra Pandey for this insightful and scholarly talk. I extend my gratitude to Dr. Shruti Das, Head of the Department of English, to organize this 11th lecture distinguished series. I thank my dear colleagues for being a part of this academic discourse. I congratulate all the participants for their active participation. Thank you everyone once again for making it a grand success. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rao. Thank you,
Thank
Pandeyji,
you.
for being with us. And I also thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor for having inaugurated this seminar of ours. Thank you all. You're free to leave now.
oh,
Thank
thank
you.
you.